Well, comrades, Marxism is an active philosophy. We believe that revolutionary theory and the ideas that we study, all the history that we talked about yesterday, is a guide to action, to changing the world. And ultimately, I think if you boil down what the chief aim of Marxism, what is the chief aim of those ideas, that theory, it is ultimately to make conscious the unconscious desires and aspirations of the working class to seize power and transform society. But if we are engaged in a class struggle, then there is an enemy camp, and they also have a set of ideas and ideology. They aim to do the reverse. The point of their ideas is to do the opposite, to confuse, to obfuscate, to stifle those aspirations, and to blur the lines of the class struggle. The bourgeois, if you look at their ideology and the origins of this, they were never a majority in society, and so in the bourgeois revolutions, you often see that they had to pose as kind of the genuine defenders of the inalienable rights of mankind, right? The genuine defenders of things like liberty, equality, fraternity. They wanted to liberate the whole of humanity in these kind of abstract terms. Because ultimately they can't rule through force alone. They need the cement ultimately of ideas, of morality, habit, tradition. But I think that we understand as Marxists that you can't abstract any of these ideas, any of these concepts from their class content. If you look at the system that we live under, the ideas of things like democracy and freedom, we're in an election year, and as the comrades mentioned, this is not a genuine kind of democracy. This is bourgeois democracy. This is the right to vote for one or another wing of the ruling class, who will ultimately, whichever candidate wins, whichever candidate gets into the White House, will represent their interests, the interests of the ruling class. If you look at the example of Venezuela, I think there you can see very clearly that bourgeois democracy was just the veil for a ruthless dictatorship of the bourgeois class. Freedom, we're given very limited freedoms under the U.S. Constitution, and the government can grant different rights and freedoms and everything. We see that very quickly those can be taken away at a whim with the Dobbs decision overruling Roe versus Wade. We have the freedom, of course, to get rich if you can, and if you can't, then you're free to sell your labor power on the market to the highest bidder, and to live in that kind of condition. And so, these ideas, we have to analyze all of them and look at the class content of what is being said. Prior to the bourgeois revolutions, prior to the bourgeois society, there was another kind of justification, another ideological justification for rule. There were kings and monarchs, and they got their right to rule from God. Basically, they had the divine right of kings. That had to be overthrown in a revolution, and it was accompanied not just with a revolution in the mode of production, but also in art, science, philosophy. Now you had the reign of reason and empiricism. You don't trust what the church tells you in the dogmas and the doctrines of the Bible, but what your five senses can ultimately tell you about the world around you. And so all of these things, I think we have to understand. Just like there are barricades in the class struggle, there are analogous barricades in the ideas that are being put forward. And the ideas don't emerge in a classless vacuum. The dominant ideas of any age are the ideas of the ruling class. And so we have to study these things and understand it clearly, because I think that there is no one-to-one, static relationship between this battle. Just because we're working class doesn't mean that we automatically inherit a working class position. We don't adopt positions in line with our class just because we're born into it. There's an enormous pressure actually to do the opposite. That habit and routine, the pressure of living under capitalism, often forces people to adopt bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas in the society. On the other hand, the bourgeois themselves, I think, are very class conscious. They're very clear about where their class interests stand in society. And they agree on all the fundamental questions, of course, up until a time when their society goes into a crisis. That agreement, that fundamental unity, can start to tear, it can start to strain, and the stability can be burst. That unity can be torn apart, and all the old ways, all the old methods of ruling can go into crisis. that's precisely the time that the working class can also begin to radicalize, look for new ways out of the impasse. And so I think that we have to understand that this is the context that we're in, the battle for ideas. In normal periods, it can suffice for us to rely on things like common sense and pragmatism and these kinds of things. But we're no longer in normal times. For a revolutionary transformation of society, you need to have revolutionary ideas. To understand the turbulence of the world that we're living in, you have to be prepared to enter into this struggle for ideas. And so pragmatism is basically a worked out philosophical view, I think, that tried to systematize something that already exists, like basically a prejudice in American society, but in a lot of different societies, a sort of anti-theoretical, anti-principled approach to society, fly by the seat of your pants, kind of idea. How many of you have heard things like, be practical, you have to be practical, or be realistic? Or in New York, people are very fond of saying, it is what it is. If you hear, play it by ear, show me the money or show me the facts, I have to see it to believe it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We have to agree to disagree. And then Nike, of course, says, just do it, right? Just do it. These ideas are pervasive. And I think that there is a difference between the colloquial usage of the term pragmatism and the philosophy that emerges at the turn of the century in the United States. But I think that you can see that the worked out philosophy that emerges from the American thinkers, particularly Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, the ideas that they bring to a philosophical conception, those things bring, I think, the innate prejudices, these kinds of philosophical prejudices to their conclusions. And what people don't study necessarily, they don't necessarily study pragmatism in a philosophical sense, but I think it's clear from all those aphorisms that people do implicitly accept a lot of the conclusions of this kind of thinking. And so for the sake of time, I can't really go into the origins of all of these ideas, but I think it is kind of interesting to say that it emerges basically with the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Progressive Era, the rise of the U.S. as a major imperialist power. And Dewey, in particular, kind of emerges as the main figurehead for this set of ideas. He was put off by the kind of mechanical materialists, the people who basically saw humanity as an inert subject, just kind of overviewing the dynamic external reality. He wanted an active philosophy. He wanted a philosophy that said something about the world that was useful. He saw that there was really a sharp division between what was going on in the university libraries and then everyday life, and he wanted to have a theory that could say something about everyday life and be useful in this kind of way. And so, to sum it up, what is pragmatism? Pragmatism, for a pragmatist, I think everything is judged from its consequences. Particularly, is it useful? If it's useful, then it's true. If it's not useful, then it's not true. Now, if something is more useful than the idea that you previously held, well, then you can cast out the other one, and the new idea is even more true. Although I think a pragmatist can't really explain how and why that process takes place. For Dewey, he explains that logic and thinking have a biological basis. He says that rational operations grow out of organic activities. And that is basically his idea. His whole idea is that we have developed things like logic to deal with our environment, to deal with problems and to problem solve. And so all of this on the surface seems pretty reasonable. They claim to have developed a scientific form of logic, an application of the scientific method to apply, to our everyday lives to deal with, problem situations and everything. But when you look at it, it's actually very one-sided and confused. It's closely linked with the empiricism and the empirical school, which basically says that everything that we can know about the world is what the world cares to tell us through our five senses. But pragmatism is ultimately concerned with the active side of the method, with problem solving and experimentation and everything. But they do kind of succumb to some of the weaknesses of the empirical method. For the empiricists, if everything comes from our senses, they sometimes set up a divide, a barrier between what we sense, our individual experience, and that external world. And they in fact started to make a division between certain qualities, which they called primary qualities, things that you could measure: solidity, density, mass, height, width, these kinds of things, which were objective, and secondary qualities, things like color and smell, touch, taste, sound. And so you have all kinds of debates that emerge over what is real. Is the color green that I see the same as the color green that you see? All these silly debates that people get into. If a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? And so the pragmatists pick this up, and they basically equate external reality and experience. They say that since we never experience that external reality aside from through our experience, you can't divorce the two. The two exist, in tandem with each other. But we reject that. We say that nature, that external reality, has an objective, independent existence, and that experience is dependent on that. That nature exists whether or not there are organic beings there to experience it or not. And so for us, yes, it's clear. The tree makes a sound whether or not somebody is there to hear it. The pragmatists take this to an extreme. William James says that ultimately reality is pure experience in his mind, and they kind of waffle back and forth between being materialists and being idealists. At best, I think they're kind of agnostic about whether or not that objective reality exists. But ultimately, they reject the idea that our ideas should correspond to that objective reality. That's the main thing. To Dewey, basically, the point of science is to experiment and achieve useful conclusions, not necessarily accurate conclusions about the nature of that objective reality. And so for him, science is not just about, basically science for us, I think, is not just a method of experimentation. It's also a body of knowledge. It accumulates laws and orders. We can hypothesize, but over time, as we gain certainty, those laws become, those hypotheses become laws. To the degree that they accurately explain the reality around us. The usefulness, I think, for us is a byproduct. And if you take the pragmatist approach, basically, they can discard an old idea because it's outmoded, but they can't really explain to you why it's outmoded. They just think it's more useful than the previous one because it doesn't actually correspond to something real. And so this is the muddled line. The pragmatists muddle the line between the subject and the object. To maybe give another illustration of this, I think, for instance, if I were to ask you what is real water? Is water the kind of water that you experience, that you can touch, that you can feel or swim in or drink? Or is H2O water, the chemical composition, the formula, the two hydrogens and oxygen? I think that most people would think that this is an absurd thing to divide those two and counterpose them. But for Dewey, that is the question. The H2O formula is merely a symbolic device. It's a way for us to order the universe. He basically poses everything like cardinal directions: north, east, west, south. All of these things are not actual natural properties of the world as it exists. They're things that we applied to understand the world. He basically applies that to everything. All of our understanding of the world is like this. And so to pragmatism, what is experienced directly is best known. And so you could take that a little bit further. Does that mean that emotions that are evoked when you smell flowers or when you listen to music, when you see a beautiful landscape, are those things, that's an experience? Is that something, is that just as true as what we see and smell and hear? And according to Dewey, yes, it's actually true. He says, empirically, things are poignant, tragic, beautiful, humorous, settled, disturbed, comfortable, annoying, barren, harsh, consoling, splendid, fearful, and they are such immediately in their own right and behalf. These traits stand in themselves on precisely the same level as colors, sounds, qualities of contact, taste, and smell. And he even explains then that language is a prerequisite to developing human logic, which is in turn, for him, our mode of interacting with the environment around us. And so then, all material instruments, the tools that we use, everything, all the culture, technique, technology are all subsumed into and derived from language. And so now the whole thing, from a little mistake in theory, has basically been turned on its head, and we have, basically what appeared to be a fairly empirical materialist approach has now been turned on its head into an idealist approach. If you read Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Lenin also draws out this method and explains, the imperial criticists and the positivists and everything were inconsistent materialists. What appeared to be materialists from the beginning, actually turned into subjective idealism. And I think similarly for Dewey, he basically says that we can't know the objective world outside of our own experience, and so it's impractical to begin from that front. We say, yes, will human knowledge ever reach 100% accuracy? Will we ever 100% know in our minds the infinite complexity and richness and everything of the universe and all the phenomena that surround us? No, of course not. We'll never have a one-to-one pairing of these kinds of things. But the whole point of scientific discovery, that process of experimentation and everything, is to gain a deeper and deeper understanding of those rich and complex processes that we have in front of us. Scientific laws that we've developed, that we've discovered, they're not just useful devices they're not just useful devices, they actually reflect that external reality, to the best of our current understanding. And they are constantly subject to continued refinement and development in a dialectical process. We believe, basically, that we understand the world in one way. We'll have a theory that explains the world, and as quantitative evidence builds up enough, you can have a qualitative shift. You can have a revolution in science that revolutionizes our understanding. But Dewey basically sees he rejects this view. He rejects that you can reach the level of a scientific law. Basically, everything that we have is just a habit that has brought results in the past. That external reality for him has no inherent logic. We're faced basically with a continually novel situation that demands innovation and experimentation and these kinds of things. In the end, basically, fundamentally, everything is kind of indeterminate. There is no necessity. And so what does that mean ultimately? Well, we often joke about the First World War that some people believe if the Archduke Franz Ferdinand had not been assassinated, then that would have been it. That would have prevented the First World War from happening. But we understand that was just a spark that set off a wildfire, and that all the kindling had been building up throughout the whole period before. That anything could have been that spark. That anything could have triggered that conflagration. But for Dewey, causality is not something that exists in the actual world. He says that causality consists in the sequential order itself. Basically, if our starting point is our own experience and not the external world, then we can observe the events that are happening, but we can only infer that one thing follows another, that those two things might be conjoined. We can't actually say that they're connected. We can't say that there's a causal connection. For Dewey, it's all logical. It's all in your head. It's not an objective property. We make those connections. They don't truly exist. That's Dewey's point of view. So, in other words, reality is essentially totally indeterminate. There are no principles or laws or logic that we can use to inform our approach about these kinds of things. We're just constantly presented with something that is entirely new. And so we emphasize experimentation and trial and error and try to find something that works, basically. And I think that we wouldn't disagree with certain aspects of this, that there is a certain reality to some of this, but ultimately we would say that reality is much more determinate, that you can actually discover laws and connections inside of things. Ultimately, there are causes behind everything that happens. The role of science, the role of investigating and scientific inquiry, is to expose the necessary connections, not that exist in our mind, but that exist in those phenomena, in that actual existing reality, not just to give us predictive power, but to understand the infinitely rich and complex nature in front of us. And so prior to World War I, right, obviously you have many different factors that build up. You have the rise of imperialism, the carving out of the globe, the rise of new capitalist powers, and the tension, therefore, between all the different major powers in the world. Where do they find resources? Where do they capture new markets? How do they expand? There's a logic to this whole process, and it's not something that we impose on those events. It's a really existing process that happened. For Dewey, all of that is just stuff that exists in your own mind. That's a way for understanding a fundamentally indeterminate, chaotic world. It's inherently conceptual. And so to sum up, maybe so far, there's been kind of a whirlwind tour of this kind of things. Reality basically is inextricably bound up with our subjective experience. This is Dewey's idea, and ideas are basically meant to motivate action or influence behavior and allow an organism to react to its natural environment. This is what he's saying, and those organisms then trundle along until they are faced with dilemmas. And the purpose of pragmatism, the purpose of ideas and logic, is to resolve those problem situations. But ideas are only affirmed by events. You only see if they're true or not based on the outcome of events. And because we play an active role in events, ultimately we as organisms make ideas true or not. And so the whole thing really does turn back into subjective idealism. To give another example, I think a child often, if you've ever seen children, they rigorously experiment with the world around them. They place objects in their mouth. They fully utilize all of their empirical senses. But eventually, they grow up and they have accumulated enough knowledge about the world that they don't have to lick everything and touch everything and feel everything. And you all, I think, have grown past this stage, and many of you took the subway here, and you don't have to lick the subway pole to get an idea of to have an idea of what that might taste like, what kind of illnesses you might catch. What once might have seemed like a fundamentally indeterminate situation that required constant experimentation and everything now has some basic principles. You know that you don't have to lick things and you might get sick. You have some ideas for how to navigate the world. If you take the method of pragmatism, it elevates trial and error over theory and principle and explaining things. You would have no consistent orientation for solving all of these problems. For Marxists, I think there's ultimately a dialectical relationship between theory and practice. We agree, you can't just read a book about swimming. Eventually, you have to jump into the pool. But also, I think it would be incorrect to toss a child into the raging ocean and give him a sink or swim kind of attitude. And so there's a dynamic between these two things. The point of theory and principle is to inform practice and vice versa. I think the pragmatists basically forget that there's a whole legacy of human history and human experience to draw from, and that's ultimately what we want to do. We have the whole accumulation of the class struggle experiences that can be generalized in the form of theory and principles that can be in turn used to inform our own practice, our own experience when we're faced with a particular situation. That requires serious study, basically, not just of what worked or didn't in the abstract. We have to understand the greater historical processes. We have to look at the context. We have to be able to separate out, the similarities and the differences, the incidental from the fundamental causes. It's not a simple arithmetic. It's a complex social calculus. And so having a correct theory and a correct method basically will not just tell you all the particulars that you need to know about a specific situation. You have to study the fundamentals of Marxism, but it doesn't tell you what the balance of forces is in the current situation. It doesn't tell you what the facts of the case are. You still have to read the news. You still have to constantly study and absorb all of this information in order to orient yourself. But if you orient yourself, basically, if you continue studying all that stuff, you read and absorb all this data. How do you draw conclusions? Do you have a method for going through these things? We are subject to all kinds of pressures and whims in everyday society, and if you're not conscious, thinking about the methods that you're using to understand the situation, then you will implicitly accept, I think, the methods that are imposed on your thinking by bourgeois society. And so I think that just to wrap up on a couple things. And we are under tremendous pressure. I think you can see this kind of thing exactly today. We're under tremendous pressure under an election to treat it as a new situation. Every election that we face, we're told not to think about what's coming. Don't think about 2028. Don't think about 2020. Think about 2024. Think about this novel situation. You're given a black and white choice between two candidates, and you have to pick. There are no other options. It's almost like if you were to try to, basically navigate by keeping your head down, not looking up ever, in front of you. But every time you hit an intersection, you just decide on a whim: do you choose left? Do you choose right? And then you'd be surprised at where you end up. There's no conscious, method. There's no conscious through line of how to get here. And I think that if you look at the elections, you see that there is a broader process that constantly, pushing to vote for the lesser evil, doesn't actually defeat the greater evil. It actually props it up, and you have Trumpism. And Trumpism is not defeated by the Democratic Party. I think that's a very clear thing. I think an analogous situation is that comrades and anybody basically who's got any sympathy for the Palestinians has been confronted with another question, that does the same kind of thing. How many of you have gotten this? Do you condemn Hamas? Yeah. There's a novel situation with a black and white answer. It's framed in a very particular way. If you try to give some historical context and talk about the last 70 years, all colonialism and everything. No. Don't do that. I'm asking you a simple yes or no question, right? And then on top of all of this, we have all kinds of other pressures. You see the news, the way that this gets covered in the news. We have to listen to quote unquote both sides, no matter what that means. You have to compromise between the extremes. You can only have gradual change, right? Because you only have a couple choices in front of you. As long as whatever that change is, as long as it's safe for the system. And ultimately, what does this lead to? This leads to a pressure to do something now, to do just what you have in front of you. Not big change, but something that you can do in the immediate pressure. I think that if you boil all of this down and look at the strategy of lesser evilism and where all of this has led to, that you keep harping on the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results, I think it shares a definition with something else. And it ultimately has not worked. So why study ideas? We had a meeting in my cell meeting the other day. We were discussing the Venezuelan revolution, and there was a sense of urgency, basically. How can we sit? Isn't it a privilege for some of us to sit here together and discuss ideas, discuss philosophy, talk about history that happened when the world is on fire, when there's massive suffering going on, when there's war and imperialism and climate change, and there's an endless doom scroll. I think that there is an enormous pressure. There's an endless doom scroll of the horrors of capitalism. And I think that we have to understand that capitalism and pragmatism and all of these ideas push us to view things, to see all of these things as individuals, and it almost weaponizes the despair, basically, that you're constantly reading, bad news and all of these things, and then you see it as an individual, and you think, what can I do as one person? What can I do about climate change and war and imperialism and all of these things? And the conclusion is not much. There's not all that much that you can do. And so the pressure of pragmatism is to do something now, to do something urgently, but to reject the bigger changes or not see the bigger changes. I think that for us, if we want to counteract these ideas, we have to understand, basically, that we have to remember that there is a bigger picture that's going on. There is an overriding, a long view of history that we have to understand. We have to remember that we are ultimately, I think, just the first in the ranks of a vast proletarian army that is beginning to awaken and is looking for ideas, looking for a way, the tools that they can use to transform society. Because ultimately, the contradictions of this system have thrown it into one convulsion after another, and I think we are headed towards a titanic struggle between these two giant classes that have been created by the process of history. The ruling class has at its disposal not only massive wealth and resources that they have at their disposal, but they also have the state and force on their side, but also the media and the academy and ideas. They are highly conscious of their interests as a class, and they will exercise all of that power to maintain their rule. On the other hand, the working class, I think, has a tremendous power that exists only in potential right now. That our task, basically, is not to fly by the seat of our pants, not to sit in the armchair and pontificate, but to absorb all of these ideas and bring them into battle. I think ultimately to forge a party that is worthy of that vast proletarian army, those people who so desperately see all of this horror that's going on in the world and want to change it. They want to do something about it. We have to have the ideas ideas and the organization that can actually do something about it. And so in that spirit, Trotsky, who wrote about the history of the Russian Revolution after accomplishing in reality that enormous task, says, dealing kind of with this idea of pragmatism, that a revolution possesses a mighty power of improvisation, but it never improvises anything good for fatalists, bystanders, and fools. Victory comes from the correct political evaluation, from correct organization, and from the will to deal the decisive blow.
All right, comrades, I want to talk more about dialectical materialism as a method and what it means to, what that means, basically, in that it's not a list of assertions imposed onto society. Rather, it's conclusions drawn from a scientific study of reality. And the only assertion that materialism makes is that matter is primary, that our ideas are a product of the real world, and that we do not need to rely on anything else to explain how the world works. We don't need to rely on God, spirits, superstition, supernatural, the soul, the afterlife, auras, mysticism, astrology, crystals, etc. Right? Yeah. And materialist philosophy really only shows up in history when humanity begins to seek answers for how the world works outside of the will of spirits or gods. And this only starts at a certain level of economic development, a point at which the surplus in society could consistently support a class of people that had idle time to think. And this happens in the case of ancient Greece, where you had the slave owners. And these ancient Greek philosophers observed nature with the intention of understanding it, and were able to arrive at some really genius insights as a consequence. So the concept of matter itself appears. The atom, as this concept of the smallest thing, the smallest you can cut something into pieces before its properties no longer resemble the original whole. This idea originates with the ancient Greeks. Dialectics also first shows up at this time with Heraclitus, and you can, this idea that contradiction lies at the root of everything, that everything is always in flux, all things come into being and pass away through strife. These observations are incredibly profound because they're still incredibly true, but like the atom, they were still just kind of very intuitive guesses. And later, on the back of the bourgeois revolutions in France and the US and elsewhere, Hegel sort of revives idealism, or revives dialectics and dialectical idealism as just a logic of thought. So it takes an idealist form, where Hegel follows the history of thought in its development and concludes that the reason similar patterns occur in the natural world as it does in philosophy is because nature is a reflection of thought rather than, not the other way around. But because we are a product of nature, right? There is no separate dimension in which thoughts exist. This is, basically, this is backwards. Of course, thought is going to reflect nature because they're one and the same reality. And Marx and Engels rescued dialectics from the stale dead end of idealism. The idea that everything comes into existence and passes away is a revolutionary idea when applied to society. Capitalism, just as it came into being, will eventually pass away and be replaced by something else, socialism. Materialist philosophy at this time had naturally tied itself to the science and was tied to the level that science and technology had developed. Before Hegel, before the revolutions, you had the Linnaean system of classification of species, right? Before you can start to understand how something works, you do have to just identify what it is first, right? Is it a plant, an animal, or a fungus? Is it a mammal, a reptile, an amphibian, sedentary, igneous, and metamorphic rock, right? First, you have to put things in boxes and categories. And so early materialists became very attached to these boxes. But Darwinism totally shattered this conception. The whole period of Enlightenment after the French and American revolutions ushered in some great thinkers that discovered how the earth changed itself, and it was the revolutions that produced this line of thought, because thought is a product of material reality and not the other way around. The development of science and technology, the development of our understanding of the world has resulted in an increased ability of our species to actually control our environment and make it work for us. We can grow massive amounts of food to feed the world population a few times over, and we could not do that, a few hundred or 1,000 years ago, right? Objectively, and this is the basis for socialism today, right? This surplus that we've created. Engels says each victory over nature takes its revenge on us, however. Our knowledge is not complete, so monocultures, deforestation, they have unintended consequences as well. In dialectical materialism, though, this is the only consistent materialism in that it accurately describes reality as one that changes and develops, is the only method that can be of use to consistent revolutionaries as we consciously work to change the world. Marx said that philosophers have only interpreted the world and the point is to change it. But the utility of dialectical materialism is in its application, and we can understand how all of these ideas, all these other philosophies arise historically. We can identify them as enemy class ideas. Because we are materialists, because we see these ideas as a product of the real world around us. And the positive element of pragmatism is that it emphasized application, but it is one-sided. It rejects the objective existence of generalizations and scientific laws. The evidence for the objective root of scientific laws, though, is in their application as well, and their ability to predict outcomes specifically. That is the whole point of science, to predict outcomes and help shape them ourselves. And so you cannot argue otherwise when looking at history in the last 200 years, that we have been able to shape society. We have the experience of countless generations to build off of, and we don't have to start from scratch with just our personal direct experience. Trotsky said in Dialectical Materialism and Science, the significance of science is to know in order to foresee and act, because the more we understand the present and the past, the natural laws of history, the better we will be able to shape the future. Just like a rocket scientist must study physics and chemistry in order to launch a rocket to the moon, we must study economics and history with our own scientific method, dialectical materialism.
Mistakes in theory will lead to mistakes in practice. That's exactly why we as Marxists know that it's absolutely important to study the Marxist method, to study Marxist theory, to apply it in our analysis, to apply it in our party building, and to apply it in our intervention in real events. Contrast what we do as Marxists with the perspective of the reformists. Now, in the United States right now, the main reformist tendencies, I would say, are the DSA, the Democratic Socialist America, including their wonderful publication, what is it called? Jacobin, and the Communist Party USA, which is basically a Stalinist organization, but let's remember, Stalinism ultimately is reformism, right? Now, how would they analyze the question of what the perspectives are for building a workers' party of this country, right? We don't have to speculate. They've said this many times. Now, what they do is they look at history through the ideas of the ruling class. They examine history with the method of the bourgeois, right? And they look back and they say, well, if you look at the past in the United States has always had a two-party system. And neither party is a workers' party. Therefore, since that's what's existed up till now, when we project in the future, we can project that it's going to be the same thing in the future. Now, let's examine that method of analyzing things. Let's say we lived at the time before the Wright brothers, and there was no airplane. So imagine then we're analyzing the potential perspective of whether people will be able to fly. And we say, if you look through history, many people have tried to fly. Some people have died trying to fly. Some people have hurt themselves very badly trying to fly. But man has not been able to fly. Therefore, in the future, man will not be able to fly. I mean, as that kind of ridiculous, superficial view of history is the method of the bourgeois, but it's not the method that can lead the working class to power. we have to have a much better understanding. Now, if you take the conclusion that they've drawn is, since a workers' party is not a perspective, therefore we have to work inside the Democratic Party. We have to work and try to capture the line, the Democratic Party line, right? But how has that worked in practice? Have they captured the Democratic Party line, or has the Democratic Party captured them? Like we see AOC and the way that she operates. Is this leading to a working class that's more conscious of itself as a class, that's more conscious of its interests and what it needs to fight for in the future? It's certainly not. It's only added confusion. It's only pushed things back to the extent that they've been able to influence things. Now, contrast that with the method of Marxism. How do we analyze the question, why is there no workers' party in the United States? Well, first of all, we would examine the history of capitalism and its development in the United States. And then we examine the development of the class struggle, which, by the way, the class struggle goes through periods where there's relative quiet, then there's sharp periods of struggle, and then it can go back to periods of quiet. We would examine that, and there are many points of ups and downs in the class struggle in the United States in the past, and we would examine that. And we would also examine concretely the efforts that were made to build a workers' party. There were actually successful workers' parties built in the United States. The only thing is, none has crossed the line into becoming a mass party. But then if that didn't happen, then you have to ask, why did it not happen? Is it just it didn't happen, therefore it can't happen? Or is it more complicated? Is it a question of the subjective factor? If the leadership had done things differently, would this outcome have changed? I think we can say that is very clear, that there were opportunities in American history when, if the leadership on the left had not taken a pragmatic approach, had taken a Marxist approach, had intervened correctly, that there could have been a quantitative increase in the development of a workers' party, and it could have become a mass party. Anyways, looking towards the future, using our method, we can say this, right? We talk about necessity and accident, right? It's absolute historical necessity for the working class to build its own party. There are a lot of objective reasons that are leading to that. We, as Marxists, must understand that, must build our forces, must intervene in that complicated and nonlinear process and push it forward as fast as possible so that the working class can and will develop a mass party. That mass party eventually must be a communist party, and it's only that kind of party that will lead the working class to victory.
You know, Kamala used to call herself a progressive prosecutor because she's a nice kind of cop. But she's changed her tune, and now she's calling herself a pragmatic prosecutor, which, according to the New York Times, suggests less of an ideological approach to change and more of a deference to what works. And not just that, also with the economy, she has her $100 million, whatever, helping small businesses plans. She said, "I promise you I will be pragmatic in my approach. I will engage in what Franklin Roosevelt called bold, persistent experimentation because I believe we shouldn't be constrained by ideology and instead should seek practical solutions to problems." And she said that she's gonna take good ideas from wherever they come, so she's gonna put Republicans in her cabinet and do whatever. You can see this hodgepodge. It serves as a tool for the ruling class to defend their system and implement their ultimately capitalist policies, which comrades have talked about. But, you know, when we talk about, I think comrades have mentioned already, it's not just that the capitalists control the media, they control the government, and they consciously, even sometimes explicitly, say they're going to be pragmatic about things. It's even more important that we're able to spot the subconscious sort of inertia, default, go-to way of thinking that permeates American culture, and frankly, not just the U.S., I think capitalist culture across the world. Trotsky did describe pragmatism as the national philosophy of the U.S., but it's not that you get taught pragmatism in school. Like, here's how to be a pragmatist. But you get taught the Pledge of Allegiance or things like that, but you don't get taught about pragmatism. And at the end of the day, this is something that has been accumulated over generations and generations in the default sort of culture of the country. And so the roots of American pragmatism are a part of how U.S. capitalism itself was established in the continent. Trotsky, in his debate with the SWP, he said that the present disdainful attitude toward the dialectic is explained historically by the fact that your grandfathers and great-grandmothers didn't need the dialectic in order to conquer territory and enrich themselves. But times have changed. Capitalism is no longer a progressive force, and therefore we need a different ideology, dialectical materialism. And so at the time, the tasks of the American bourgeoisie were relatively simple. They had to achieve independence from Britain in order to develop their own system in the continent, and they could have simple slogans like independence, no taxation without representation, and for that they could base themselves on the ideology that had been developed by the rising bourgeois class in Europe, right? Rationalism, the idea of that reason is progressive as opposed to religion, and obscurantism, the rights of man, and so forth, and empiricism. They didn't need to develop their own ideas; they could just borrow the ideas that had been developed in Europe. And once they achieved independence, they didn't, unlike the European capitalists and their philosophers, they didn't need to struggle against this century-old institution. The U.S. didn't have a Catholic Church that had imposed its rule for centuries. It didn't have a feudalism, anything like that. And so, of course, there were pre-capitalist forms in the U.S. You had the native Indians in the continent, but they didn't need philosophy, frankly, to carry out a massacre and a genocide and just conquer territory. It was a very pragmatic thing to just continue to move west, start a business, whatever, have your own little plot of land, and you didn't need to have an ideology to go against the old ideology of feudalism. And a quick quote from Marx that I think is very helpful to understand this, from the 18th Brumaire. He said that in the US, the feverish youthful movement of material production, which has to make a new world of its own, has neither time nor opportunity left for abolishing the old world of ghosts. So even in terms of religion and things like that, which in Europe they had to fight tooth and nail to kind of go against that religious obscurantism, in the US you don't even have to worry about it. And there's an example, for example, when Lincoln was in the middle of the Civil War, someone told him that he was sure that God was on the side of the North and of Lincoln with regard to the Civil War. And Lincoln responded, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." So again, he didn't care about gods or no God or whatever. He just needed to win that war. It was a very pragmatic thing. There's a lot to be said about that, how the war ended through compromise, which again was an expression of that pragmatic outlook. So comrades, I think just to finish, Trotsky said that the method of thought can be dialectic or vulgar, conscious or unconscious, but it exists and it makes itself known. And as the revolutionary vanguard of the American working class, we have to be conscious of these pressures and these ideas, consciously combat them. And Trotsky gave great importance to this. He at a time when he was being persecuted by fascism, by Stalinism, all of his family was literally being killed, as they were building the Fourth International. He wasn't just talking about fascism and all these things. He was actually saying, comrades, you must take up the struggle against the distortions of dialectical materialism in the US. That's the thing that mattered the most. There is nothing more important than this. Pragmatism, empiricism is the greatest curse of American thought. You must inoculate younger comrades against its infection. And I think this school is proof that we're heeding his advice and we will build the revolutionary communist of America on solid ideological foundations.
How many of you have, had a diagnosis of something before? It's very useful to put a name on something, but that just gives you the beginning of a treatment. It doesn't actually treat anything. You still need to act on that diagnosis, and sometimes that can be a helpful thing for you to do. And so I think that's kind of a similar thing. We have a whole series of characteristics. We can study the ideas of pragmatism and everything. But if you start recognizing it everywhere in society, you can't just point your finger at it and name it. I think most people, if you were at a paper sale and you said, that's pragmatism, what you're expressing, they would say, thank you. Yeah, that is. I think most people would appreciate that. So I think that the real important thing for us is that studying these ideas is important to basically to use it as a foil to understand dialectical materialism. Sometimes I talk to comrades and they say, I don't know when I'm thinking dialectically or when I'm not thinking dialectically. And I think that this is a really good example. Well, are you treating things as a black and white, categorical, yes or no, only looking at the situation, or are you trying to understand things as a process and their contradictions and all of their development and how these things are coming about. I think it gives us a chance to strengthen the dialectical muscle. And so I agree, comrades should read the history of philosophy, because there are a lot of other ideas that we can use as a foil to understand and strengthen our dialectical muscle. There were a couple questions about the different variants of pragmatism and all these different things. In fact, actually, in doing some of the research for this, it's a little bit like in style now. William James is making in particular kind of a big comeback, and there are a lot of people who are looking at this as like, the kind of philosophy. For them, the idea, what they were trying to do was basically come up with a method. For William James, pragmatism was like, we can get rid of all the scholastic debates about different things. If you're fighting over, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, it doesn't really matter as long as the outcomes are the same. We don't need to discuss this kind of thing. And so I think that there's something attractive to Americans in that kind of thing, that is just a method for inquiry and problem solving and everything. But they have a desire to be free. If you read James, he says that pragmatism is basically the attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking towards last things, fruits, consequences, facts. And that, I think, is just like, it's again, he's just theorizing, he's just systematizing a prejudice that already exists, a pressure that already exists in society. But the thing is that there's a logical inconsistency in all of this. And yeah, there is a swapping of the objective and the subjective and everything. Just to give one maybe quick example, Dewey rejected the class struggle. He said that basically you can explain the whole of human history according to human cooperation. That's the real fundamental lines of society, social clubs and unions and collective labor and these kinds of things. But what he doesn't understand is that all of that can exist on the basis of class antagonisms, and that if you don't really understand that fundamental contradiction, the class antagonisms in society, then you don't understand the real lines, the explosions and the things that are coming out. Peirce was kind of like a Renaissance man. If you read him, he's actually kind of interesting. He was a scientist and came up with like the logic, the kind of logic that computers use. I don't really know, but there was a comrade, an engineer comrade, who was reading it and was very excited by that. I don't know anything about that. James though, I think is one that's making a big comeback, and you can see there's like a thoroughly Americanness to his ideas. He says, for instance, an idea is true so long as we believe that it is profitable to our lives to believe it. And that's why if you find something that's more profitable, you can just discard that one and take the more profitable one. He says in talking about ideas, you must bring out of each word its practical cash value and set it at work within the stream of your experience. It appears less than as a solution than as a program for more work, and particularly as an indication of the ways in which existing realities can be changed. And so you see this kind of thing, logical inconsistencies. What seems like it's very materialist in the beginning is fundamentally transformed. He also says, just to share a couple, it's just really interesting. The ideas, which are themselves but part of our experience, become true just insofar as they help us get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience, and that we can, that we take these ideas, we use them, we move them, we move forward with them, but on occasion we make nature over again by their aid. So there's the logical inconsistency, ultimately leads this to a contradiction. The whole thing is geared towards practical results, but I think that there are a lot of examples that comrades gave of what are the practical results. I think compromise, for instance, which has come up also in the discussion more, has and this idea that we need to hear both sides and reject the extremes and meet in the middle and this kind of thing, has a deep history in the U.S. in particular. The whole constitution of the country was a compromise basically between the North and the slaveocracy in the South, which in order to maintain their rule, the political balance, the delicate political balance between them, they had to agree that the black slaves that had been imported into the country were 3/5 of a person. It's a political compromise. And then as you start to incorporate more and more territory, there's a question of whether or not those states are going to be slave states or free states. And so they have the Missouri Compromise. They settle that on the 36th parallel or so, that above above will be free and below will be slave states. Then you have the massive incorporation of Texas. You have the Louisiana Purchase. All of these things start to strike against the compromises that are being made. And so they have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They decide, let's give it to the states. We'll just have popular sovereignty. And that opens up this whole episode called Bleeding Kansas. It's basically a mini civil war before the Civil War. Ultimately, there was a fundamental contradiction between those two classes that had to be resolved in a class struggle, in a revolution. That's what the Civil War ultimately was. And you couldn't, the patchwork of compromises and the duct tape and the gum that they were trying to hold the country together with, it couldn't hold that contradiction together. And I think that, this kind of constant iterative, dealing with one thing after another, it boxes people into an absurd situation in the end. And I think that there are a lot of comrades that give everyday examples of this when you talk about it. But I think Stalinist zigzags are another really excellent example of this kind of thing. You're presented with a situation and you have to address it. And so the communist parties take this ultra-left line of social fascism, and what does that lead them to? It leads them to the direct opposite. All the parties are social fascists and Trotsky fascists, except for the actual fascists. And then, of course, you have the victory of fascism, and so they swing over into the Popular Front, and they in Spain, they ally with the shadow of the bourgeois, and over again, they zigzag between these things because they're only dealing with what's right in front of their nose. And so it's a tendency to never get at the root of things, never understand the real contradictions, the real essence, but to only stop halfway and to put up the banner, mission accomplished. And I think that's kind of the thing. You have the reformists do the same kind of thing. The DSA says, look, we got people elected, mission accomplished, it worked, that's it. And now look at where they are. And so I think that this question also came up of do something now, and the pressure to do something now, and how to deal with it, and all of these philosophical things. And I think it is kind of interesting, the debate between, Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg in the Second International ultimately is really about all of these ideas. She was defending dialectical materialism against this short-term approach that Bernstein was putting forward. And all of those debates, I think, are worthy of really, digging into it and studying it and understanding it, because she basically, puts forward this, this question comes up. Bernstein kind of poses this question: do revolutionaries fight for reforms? He poses it in a kind of a yes or no, black and white sort of way. And she explains, that there's a dialectic to this. Yes, we do fight for reforms. This is how the working class learns. It learns through experience. Even though reforms, as long as you have capitalism, they're limited. They're limited and they can be taken away. And so you have to fight for revolution. She talks about it as the ultimate aim. If you do what Bernstein does and just look at the reform that's in front of you, and then the next thing that's in front of you, and then the next thing, and you do this slow, gradual change, you remove what she says the soul of the struggle, the fight for revolution. And ultimately, if your ultimate aim is just to get this particular reform that's in front of you, or that particular seat, then you give up everything. If you give up the revolutionary cause, you'll do whatever you need to get that seat. You'll do whatever you need to win that strike. You'll scratch whoever's back you need to. You'll do backroom deals. You'll do all because that's not what you're, you've taken out the soul of the struggle. You don't need to use revolutionary methods to do what you're actually trying to do, to help the working class learn through the experience of that struggle. And so there's another final little contradiction that I think is worthwhile for us to think about and understand, which is that it's often said that revolution is impossible until it's inevitable. And what this describes basically is the molecular process of revolution, the tiny, imperceptible, incremental little changes that are happening all around us right now. I think there are lots of people, you talk about inflation and the grind of everyday life. When you go to the grocery store and you see people frustrated at the prices that are there, and they're focused on something quite small, but really quickly that can transform into a much bigger thing. The dejection on the subway, the traffic, all these kinds of things. We have to understand that class, all this molecular process that's going on, they will be transformed, and it won't just be a transformation into masses of people struggling for their bread and butter issues. If you look at the example of Venezuela, there's millions of people that are coming out onto the streets, yes, fighting for those concrete reforms, but there's a tremendous hunger for ideas, literature, art, science, philosophy, politics, history. They want to understand the world. They want to change the world. And I think that's the key thing, is if we want to be a party worthy of that class, then we have to raid the bookstore. We have to raid all of the history and the theory and the philosophy and everything, the treasure trove that we have the immense historic privilege to have time to study, to have time to get some depth in. And then we need to not just identify and diagnose things like pragmatism, we need to patiently explain and build up a party that can win over the masses to a program that can actually transform society.